Welcome to class. This is the fourth module, and we'll be discussing aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And like this, you'll be able to understand the broad force that shape the overall economic requires, which require more than analyzing individual market. And the module will try to explore how economics use aggregate demand and supply to examine how output, employment, and prices interact at a national level. As an introduction, aggregate demand represents the total demand for goods and services in an economy at various price level. And on the part of the aggregate supply, it shows the total outputs that firms are willing to and able to produce at different price level. And as per the macroeconomics analysis, the aggregate demand and supply are central to explaining short-run fluctuation, the long-run growth, and also policy response. And as per key concepts, it actually includes the multiplier effects, the output gap, which is the recessionary or inflationary aspect of it. And as per the policy implication, these two concepts is very, very important for fiscal and monetary intervention to address economic challenges. What are the components of aggregate demand? Just like I said, aggregate demand is a total expenditure of an economic goods and services, which reflects demand from all sectors, like the from the household, business, government, and the foreign sector. And this is denoted by the formula. The C is the consumption, the I is the investments, government, and then the exports is the foreign sector. And for the consumption, it is actually the expenditure by household on goods and services, and it is the largest component of the aggregate demand, and it is influenced by disposable income, the interest rates, the confidence, and wealth. For the investment, it is an expenditure on capital goods for future production, and this is influenced by interest rates, the business expectation, and credit access. And it is crucial for long-term economic growth. As per government spending, which is the G in the formula, it is that these are current and capital expenditure on goods and services, and these are influenced by fiscal policies and political priorities, and it excludes transfer payments like pensions. And lastly, for net export, it is the value of export minus import. And when we talk about the positive value, we have the positive value, we have the negative value. So when we talk about the positive value, it shows trade surplus, and as per the negative value, it shows trade deficit, and this reduces the aggregate demand. It is affected the net export is affected by exchange rates, the trade policies, and global demands. For the component of aggregate supply represents the total output producers are willing to and able to supply at different price level, and it is categorized into the short run and the long run aggregate supply. For the short run aggregate supply, it is influenced by production cost and input availability, and the determinants of this includes the wages, the raw material prices, exchange rates, the taxation, and productivity level. And as per the long run aggregate supply, it reflects maximum potential output with full resource employment, and it is not influenced by price level. And the determinants of this includes the labor quantity or quality, the capital stock, the technological progress, and the institutional factor and natural resources. For the macroeconomics equilibrium, it occurs when the aggregate demand equals to aggregate supply, and balancing planned expenditure with planned output. It is balancing planned expenditure with planned output. And for this, it determines the national income, the GDP, and general price level and employment rate. Also, it guides macroeconomics policy in terms of the expansionary and contractionary parts. And for the short run, we also have the short run and the long run equilibrium. When we talk about the short run equilibrium, it is where the aggregate demand intersects the SRAS, the short run, and which may not align with the full employment. For the long run equilibrium, it occurs when the aggregate demand, the SRAS and the LRAS all intersect at potential outputs. And the short run equilibrium can result in a recessionary gap, which is below full employment, or the inflationary gap, which is above full employment, while the long run equilibrium at this point, the economy operates at its most efficient level with full resource utilization, the stable income, and no cyclical employment. We also have this equilibrium in the macroeconomics, and for this, it occurs when the aggregate demand does not equal the aggregate supply, and this leads to economic consequences like inflation and employment. For when the aggregate demand is greater than the aggregate supply, we see it as inflationary gap, and when the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply, we see it as the recessionary gap. And for the inflationary gap, this is an excess demand that pushes up price, resulting in demand pull inflation. And the example of this is if potential output is 70 trillion naira, but demand rises to 80 trillion, and there is a 10 trillion excess that has been created. And for recessionary gap, this is an insufficient demand that leads to inventory buildup, low production, and job cuts. An example of this is when output is 65 trillion, but spending falls to 55 trillion, creating 10 million shortage. Another key concept is the leakage and policy significances. And in real world scenario, not all income received is spent within the domestic economy. Some of it may be saved, they may be taxed or spent on imports. These are called leakages. So when we have some of the income being saved, being taxed, or spent on income, this is known as leakages. And talking about the savings, is a portion of the income that is saved and does not re-enter the spending cycle. Also, as per the taxes, government collect taxes from income which may not immediately be used for productive spending. And lastly, the import aspect, spending on imported goods benefit foreign economies instead of domestic producers. So these leakages reduces the amount of income that recirculates, and hence the size of the multiplier. Therefore, economics use a more comprehensive multiplier formula that accounts for these leakages. And as you see it there, it's there. And what is the policy implication for this? Government uses the multiplier to estimate the impact of fiscal policy and increased spending or tax cuts can stimulate demand during recession. And lastly, reduced spending or high taxes can moderate demand during inflation. We also see we've been talking about gaps, and we need to talk about the output gap. And when we talk about the output gap, it is difference between actual and potential GDP, which indicates economic performance relative to its productive capacity. And we have the negative output gap and the positive output gap. For the negative output gap, its actual output is below potential, which is, for example, um, on 105 trillion versus 120 trillion potential. And there is a negative 15 trillion gap. And this is associated with unemployment and weak demand. For the positive output gap, the actual output exceeds potential. For example, where we have a 120 trillion actual and a 120 trillion 128 trillion actual and 120 trillion potential, we have a positive gap of 8 trillion naira, and this leads to inflationary pressure. So in conclusion, we've been able to look into the aggregate demand and supply, and having an understanding about this plus the multiplier and output gaps equip policy makers to address economic challenges and promote stability. Thank you.